In this section, we're going to get into the details of the 5 categories that comprise the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. The CTSCA requires a company to, at a minimum, disclose to what extent, if any, the retailer or manufacturer engages in verification of product supply chains to evaluate and address risks of human trafficking and slavery. Remember, we said this in the previous section. This act is about disclosure. U.S. importers that are subject to the act must disclose what they're doing to help eradicate forced labor. And then the consumer can judge with their wallet and decide whether they want to buy from a given importer. Second bullet, the verification disclosure must specify if the verification was done by a third party. This is an important point because U.S. importers, certainly that have the resources to do so, can go out to factories themselves with their own employees, with people from the sourcing department to engage in these verifications. Or they can also use a third party, which is fine, but sometimes a little bit of control can be lost when using a third party. That's why this specification is required. The company must confirm whether it engages in verification to identify, assess, and manage the risk of human trafficking in its supply chain. And that is both domestic U.S., because it can happen here too, as well as internationally. This means that a company on its website has to make an explicit declaration, a confirmation about whether or not it engages in the verification of these points. Another slide on verification. The Act recommends that the company describe the methodology it uses to verify entities in the supply chain in assessing risks related to human trafficking. The theme, once again, is about disclosure. What is a U.S. importer doing to eradicate forced labor? Well, that requires, or at least a recommendation is made for the company to describe its methodology. How does it go about doing things related to the eradication of forced labor? That includes, as we see in the sub-bullet here, information on the frequency of verifications. How many times in a year does a U.S. importer engage in these verifications? It is also recommended that companies assess and manage the potential risk of working with vendors that use temporary labor agencies and brokers. This is very clever on the part of the Transparency Act because overseas suppliers, just like companies in the U.S., can use temp labor, can use labor agencies and brokers, and distance themselves from some of these labor-related violations. It's only a recommendation in the Act. Truly conscientious importers should make this a requirement. Moving on to audits, the actual activities that take place. CTSCA requires companies to disclose to what extent audits are carried out on vendors for compliance with trafficking and slavery standards. The operative phrase here, disclose to what extent audits are carried out. The Act isn't telling people how to do audits, although recommendations are made. They're saying, per the law, a U.S. importer has to disclose to what extent those audits are carried out. Disclosures must state if audits are independent and unannounced, another great requirement, because if we think about it, if we're a U.S. importer subject to the Transparency Act, and we give a vendor in Bangladesh 3 months' notice that we're coming over to do an audit, what's that vendor going to do? They're going to clean up their act if they're in violation, put on a good show, and if they are indeed violators, go right back to what they were doing after the fact. This requirement is quite good. The company should describe the audit methodology. They're not being told how to do the audit. They're being asked to describe the methodology. And as we saw with the ILO, as we saw with the UN, and other tools that are out there, there are great best practices to adopt. Finally, on this slide, the company must provide statistics on the timeline, frequency, and number of announced versus unannounced audits. If the idea is to provide the U.S. consumer with as much information about what a U.S. importer is doing to eradicate forced labor, these are some great requirements and recommendations. Now, let's talk about certification. So we've had verification, audits, now certification. Per the Act, companies must disclose to what extent suppliers are required to certify that raw materials used in production comply with human trafficking laws. We mentioned this briefly not too long ago. Not only what are our vendors doing, but how are they working with their Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 suppliers, the companies in country that are supplying them with the raw materials that they need. This extends the Act further up the supply chain and hopefully gets more and more entities in line with its requirements. Certification disclosure must explicitly state whether or not vendors are required to provide certification. On that U.S. importer's website, they have to say whether or not vendors are required to provide certification. Obviously, certification is a higher standard, much more desirable, and something that a consumer can get their heads around when they're judging the acts of U.S. importers. Last bullet here, the company must provide a general description of the certification requirement and any consequences for violation. What are the penalties for violation? Perhaps to the extreme that a U.S. importer will no longer do business with a supplier that is in violation. As we can see, some pretty strong language in the Act. Internal accountability. The fourth point, and that means what is the U.S. importer not only doing with suppliers, but how do they create within their own company the structure, policies, and culture that leads to a real commitment to accountability, to making sure that the vendors a U.S. importer works with are not in violation. Very much in line with the theme of disclosure, in our first bullet point, we see that a company must disclose to what degree the company maintains internal accountability standards and procedures for both employees and or contractors related to human trafficking and slavery. This is very much a sourcing activity. That's why it's included in the sourcing module. A strategic approach from the get-go, from the moment a U.S. importer evaluates a country, all the way down to evaluating individual vendors, onboarding those vendors, and continuing to work with them. It's a sourcing activity, but it is the responsibility of the entire company. That's why in bullet 1, we talk about a disclosure about the entire company and how it maintains internal accountability standards and procedures for everybody that's an employee and third-party contractors too. Explicitly state whether or not the company has internal accountability standards in place. Provide a description of said internal standards, the rules of the game for employees and its contractors to follow. Here's a great one, second to the last bullet point. Publish a code of conduct that can be seen by all parties in the lunchroom, in the break room, in public gathering areas. Publish, share, go over, and train on the code of conduct of a given company. And of course, describe preventative and corrective actions, because eventually a U.S. importer is going to discover some violations. What can we do to proactively prevent those violations in the first place? But when we discover them, what are the specific corrective actions that are going to be taken? That is internal accountability. Training, as we see in the title of this slide, is the fifth of the 5 categories included in the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. In our first bullet, we see that the training component of the law requires disclosure of the level of training provided to both employees and management on human trafficking and slavery. Consistent with our theme around disclosure, training requires that a company state the level of training and education provided to both employees and management. This is important because employees, like in any social setting where there are lots of people around, take their behavioral cues from management. That's why management must be trained as well. The emphasis, as we see in our second bullet, is on mitigating risk across the supply chain. The Transparency in Supply Chains Act isn't about reacting to the discovery of violations. It is also about mitigating risk, taking measures ahead of time to prevent this stuff from happening in the first place. That's an essential philosophical approach to be taking, especially in a training environment. The Act requires an explicit statement on whether or not a company provides such training and provide a description of training and level of employees being trained, from entry level all the way up to the CEO. And this is so important that adherence to the Act should be coming from the CEO in messages, in reiterations, in participation, in training. Everything starts at the very top. Here we have a real-world example, publicly available information, so this is not proprietary in any way. Quite the contrary, this is part of the disclosure that Skechers makes on their website. A very good example of an ethical company seeking to do business with ethical suppliers. This is just one excerpt. It's much longer, but it really gets the point across. Let's have a couple of looks. It is a requirement for all manufacturers doing business with Skechers to comply with Skechers guidelines for responsible factory operations. First point, Skechers clearly has a published set of guidelines for vendors to use in their factories. Skechers is saying, these are the rules of the game for us to do business with you. Compliance with the guidelines for responsible factory operations is mandatory and is required in order to do business with Skechers. A company can't be more explicit than that. Manufacturers are also required to post these guidelines, as well as all labor laws and other internal policies in the workplace, in both English and the local language or languages where they may be seen by employees. What a great approach. Because as auditors from Skechers go out who perhaps don't speak the local language, they can see it in English. Skechers further requires that all manufacturers certify that they do not employ, in whole or in part, convict labor, forced labor, indentured labor, or child labor at any stage of the manufacturing process. Any stage. Here, Skechers is requiring certification. That's an additional higher standard by which vendors will be judged. Clearly, Skechers is taking this act to the max and should be commended for doing so. Let's move down and look at auditing of suppliers, actual checking of suppliers. Manufacturer factories are regularly audited by Skechers employees, not third parties, employees. Factories are audited for a number of issues, chief among which is verification of the absence of forced or child labor. The presence of forced or child labor would mean the immediate failure of the audit and the right for Skechers to terminate any relationship with such manufacturer. These audits are done on both a scheduled and an unannounced basis and include interviews with the manufacturer's employees themselves. That higher standard coming to life in Skechers' disclosure statement. Everything is done by Skechers employees. The purpose is explicit. The consequences of failure are explicit, and the emphasis on speaking to actual employees. This is a very good real-world example. In this case, Skechers' disclosure statement. Great work by them. Okay, we're going to wrap up this section, and when we resume, we're going to get into some heavy-duty stuff, sourcing and the calculation of landed cost. From the very beginning, from Module 1, we've been talking about some aspect, some component of landed cost. We have upwards of 50 slides in the following sections that mathematically illustrate how to calculate those landed costs. This is a good one. Come back as soon as you can.